Hi everybody, the Romance of Redemption Part 2. We're continuing to look at the way in which God loves us through the book of Ruth, and today we're introducing Ruth herself. The dictionary says that redeeming is the action of regaining or gaining possession of something in exchange for payment. In Revelation 5, we saw that our Redeemer made the payment with his blood. But which is it? Did he redeem us so that we could regain something, or so that we could gain something new? Let's have a look at the first few verses in Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Let's look at each of these verses in turn. First of all, in verse 1, we're told that it was in the days when the judges ruled. Now, the book immediately before Ruth is the book of Judges, and the very last verse in that book says that it was a period when every man did what was right in his own eyes, which tended to mean that they weren't doing what was right in God's eyes. We see that in this first verse as well, because we see that this was a time of famine in the land. Now in Deuteronomy chapter 11, God's actually promised that he would be blessing his people as long as they stayed obedient to him. And remember, this is the land that was promised to them, a land flowing with milk and honey. So instead of flowing with milk and honey, instead of God's blessing, they were experiencing famine, just reinforcing the point that they were doing what was right in their own eyes and not in God's. We also see that they were from Bethlehem, which means house of bread. But at this point, there was no bread in the house of bread. In verses 1 and 2, we also see that they went to Moab. Now, in order to go to Moab, they had to go through the pass of Jericho. You might recall the destruction of Jericho when the people of Israel went into the promised land. Immediately before they crossed the Jordan River, they destroyed the city of Jericho, and everybody in it got killed, except only Rahab the prostitute, and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent, in Joshua chapter 6. Now Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5 tells us that Boaz was the son of Rahab. So when we're told here in verse 1 that this occurred in the time of the judges, we know it actually occurred very early in the period of the judges, because Boaz was the son of Rahab. We're also told in verse 2 that they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. So there were a number of towns called Bethlehem, but this was the Bethlehem in Judah, and they were Ephrathites. Let's skip ahead to Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, remember these were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. You, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. Remember, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Judah. What we see here in Micah is that from everlasting, and what we see in Revelation chapter 5, to everlasting. We see the picture from the throne room of heaven at the end of all things. All between that time, in fact, the entire period of creation, God loves us. He's courting us. He's wanting to be in relationship with us. I want to have a look at a map now of the region. What this map shows us, on the left is Egypt, and the people of Israel left Egypt, wandered through the wilderness, went through the land of Moab, and when they did that, had all sorts of strife with the people in Moab, and then finally went through Jericho, crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And what we have here is Bethlehem, Judah, which is where Elimelech and Naomi came from. What they did is they went through the pass of Jericho to Moab. Notice the arrows here, they went in exactly the opposite direction to where God had told the people of Israel to go. Let's have a look at verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Why didn't she just return to Israel at that point? My wife Jill came to Australia with her husband as missionaries, together with their 2 daughters. Whilst here, they had a son, and about 10 years later, her husband died. Many people expected her to return to the UK, where she was from. But her kids went to school here and had friends here. Her eldest daughter was dating the boy that she would later marry. Jill didn't want to uproot her children from the place that felt like home. Perhaps that was Naomi's motive as well. Perhaps this choice to stay indicates that Naomi was a loving mother. In verses 4 and 5, we're told that the 2 sons were married about 10 years and died. In verse 1, we're told they went to Moab for a while, so their intention had been to go there for a small period of time, but they ended up staying for over 10 years. And notice too that it would have been quite unusual in those days to be married 10 years and not have children. We're also told that they married Moabite women. Remember, as I said before, when we looked at that map, they went through the land of Moab and had all sorts of problems. One that you might recall is the story of Balak, the king of the Moabites, who joined with the Midianites in hiring Balaam to curse Israel. How did they achieve that cursing? They got the young men of Israel to intermingle with women from Moabite. And the young men were led astray, not only by the women, but also the idols whom they worshipped. And in Numbers 25, Israel is condemned for intermarrying with Moabite women. And yet here we see these 2 sons married Moabite women. So what we have is a threefold turning away from God in these early verses. We have, first of all, that Israel as a nation, they did what was right in their own eyes, and the blessing of God had been removed from the land. We see that with the famine. Elimelech and Naomi went the wrong way. They went back the way they'd come, that Israel had come. So they weren't obediently following God where they were, trusting that he would bless them there, but rather decided to go back where the grass seemed greener. They went the wrong way. And the sons married Moabite women, even though that was condemned and typically would lead to the young men who did that worshipping idols rather than worshipping Yahweh. So in the early verses of this book, we see this threefold turning away from God. And yet clearly the message here is that although they were being unfaithful to God, God remained faithful to them. We see this also in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Even when we are unfaithful to him, he loves us. One of the main messages of this book is that God is at work in the worst of times. Even when, as Naomi, you think that he is far away from you or has turned against you, he never leaves you. He is faithful even when we are not. Now I want to look at verses 6 to 18, and I'll read through them here with you. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Notice here in verse 6, effectively, there is bread again in the house of bread in Bethlehem. And we see that reinforced in verse 22 at the end of the chapter, when the women arrived back in Israel just in time for the beginning of the barley harvest. In verse 7, we see Naomi decides to return to her hometown. We can imagine that she would be fretting over how she might be received, because she'd left her home country to go into the country of an enemy. And she'd lost everyone. Her former neighbours might have considered her losses predictable or even just, because she'd turned her back on God and these things had happened. In those verses, we also see her mother's love. This was first hinted at in verse 3. And here we have it again. She tells her daughters-in-law to return to their mothers' homes. That's an unusual phrasing. It was a patriarchal society. You would expect her to say to return to the father's home. But the deliberate use of mother here presumably is just getting us to think about her as the mother, Naomi as the mother, instead of just seeing her as the childless widow. She knows what will face her daughters-in-law in Israel. Moab was an enemy of Israel, and they didn't worship Yahweh. Intermarriage with Moabites was condemned. Her daughters-in-law would face persecution, stigmatizing, ridicule, racism. She loved them, and she didn't want them to experience that. All 3 women were grieving. The 2 daughters-in-law, their husbands, who were Naomi's sons. To be a childless widow, and all 3 of them were childless widows, to be a childless widow in those days was to be amongst the lowest and most disadvantaged in society. There was no one to support you, and you had to live off the generosity of strangers. All three women were in this position, but it would be even worse for her daughter-in-laws back in Israel as foreigners. Have a look at verses 11 to 13. If the husband died, one of his brothers could marry the widow, and their first son would be deemed the son of the dead brother. But Naomi was too old to have more children. Those verses might seem strange to us, but they're explained in Deuteronomy 25. And this is the near kinsman redeemer law. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. You might remember in the first session that we had together, I asked you the question about how could King David and eventually Jesus be in a Jewish line if Ruth was not a Jew and Jewishness is passed through the mother? Here we have the answer. The son that Ruth bore to Boaz, called Obed, Obed was physically the son of Ruth and Boaz, but he was deemed to be the son of Elimelech and Naomi through the near kinsman law. So although he was physically born to a woman who was not a Jew, he was deemed to be the son of Naomi, who was a Jew. Now, I should say here, there is some debate about this idea of Jewishness through the mother. That's a current tradition of the Jews, and it's been a tradition of the Jews since sometime after King Solomon. But when exactly it came into being is unknown. For example, King Solomon himself had many foreign wives, and yet all of his children were considered Jewish. So it may be that Boaz's and Ruth's children would have been considered Jewish even though Ruth was not a Jew. But we still have the problem that we discussed last time of Deuteronomy 23. Deuteronomy 23 says that for 10 generations, the descendants of a Moabite are not permitted to enter the assembly of God. So what we have here is Boaz and Ruth's son Obed, and then his son Jesse, and then his son David, who became king. That's 3 generations, not 10. How is it that they could worship in the assembly of God? It's because they were deemed not to be the children of or the descendants of Ruth, but rather of Naomi by her husband Elimelech, because of the near redeemer, kinsman redeemer rule. Let's have a look at verses 14 to 18. The speeches here of Naomi and Ruth are unique in all of Scripture. This is the only place where we have a dialogue between 2 women that does not concern a man, a father, a husband, or a son, but only each other's welfare. And it reveals Ruth's love for her destitute mother-in-law. I want to draw out some things about her love that are shown here. She was leaving her own family and land and would never return home. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. She was choosing to follow Naomi and stay there even after Naomi had died. We know, we have the benefit of hindsight, we know how the story ends. But place yourself in Ruth's position at this point in time. As far as she knew, this was a commitment which would mean a life of being a widow and childless, because Naomi had no man to give her, and if Ruth married a non-relative, her commitment to Naomi's family would end. She was going to an unknown land with a new people, new customs, and a new language. She also said, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Notice the "will be" here. For 10 years, she had been married to one of the sons of Naomi. But here we've got the phrasing "will be." So clearly, in those 10 years, she had continued to worship the Moabite idols. But here is a turning. She is now saying, not only will the people of Israel be her people, but she is choosing the God of Israel as well. Your God will be my God. This is despite the fact that Naomi had just said in verse 13, "The Lord's hand has turned against me." Naomi's experience of God was bitterness. But in spite of this, Ruth forsakes her own religious heritage and makes the God of Israel her God. She will worship the God that Naomi believes has abandoned her. From everlasting to everlasting, our Redeemer loves us. Each of us, Naomi, Ruth, you, me, even in the worst of times when, as Naomi, you think that the Lord's hand has turned against you, the truth is, He is laying the foundation stones of greater blessing in your life. Near the end of the book, the women tell Naomi what has been evident all along, that Ruth's love is worth more than 7 sons. Grace is walking beside Naomi, unseen, yet refusing to leave her. Thank you.